Hello, everyone. I'm Curt Gunsenheimer of Iris Capital. We're an early to late stage venture investor and growth capital investor. And I'm joined by Rafael Laguna, CEO of Open-XChange. And we thought we would do something slightly different, which is to shed light on the sector of open source. I think it's fair to say, Rafael, open source has been a long forgotten part of software, at least from the investor community. And now suddenly a rush of focus has come to the space. We've seen companies like SUSE Linux that people had totally forgotten now be acquired for $2.5 billion just recently. A company that Iris Capital backed, Talent, came out of nowhere to do a fantastic IPO on NASDAQ and really taking over the data integration field with a open source based technology. And yourself, Open-XChange, people might be familiar with you because you've been around for quite some time, suddenly coming out of the woods and ending up with a dominating market share in your market, 100% market share among ISPs in Europe, in the US. What is the dynamic behind that trend in open source?
I think it was Mark Andreessen who said that software is eating the world. I might add that open source is eating the software world. You see the quality of software that comes out of successful open source projects is just so high and unbeatable by enterprise software that comes out of a single company that given time, and it takes time, sometimes it takes 10, 15, 20 years. You may have seen Microsoft now bundling Linux with Windows, even on the desktop, and running lots of workloads on open source software on Azure, probably more than any Microsoft workloads on Azure. And the reason for that is that open source software has simply taken over whole categories of software, especially on the infrastructure side. I mean, if you run a web server, it probably runs on Linux, it probably runs Nginx or Apache. You know, you use the whole Linux stack with everything that's in it. Open-XChange is part of that. If you do email or DNS, you know, our Dovecut email server is used by 75% of all IMAP servers out there. Our Power DNS is used by 30, 40% of all them out there, just because it's the best software. You create a virtuous circle. You put your stuff out there, more people use it, you get feedback and additions to your software, you bake it into a release, you rinse and repeat for 10 years or so, and you end up simply having the best software. Also, another thing that we've seen, and maybe the Huawei case is a good example of that, a lot of people now regard dependency on technology providers as a critical factor in their own success. So now if you're depending on one proprietary vendor and you can't switch, and something happens, and it doesn't need to be as big as Huawei, the Huawei case, then you are not in control of your own fate. And of course, open source gives you the freedom of choice, and even forking the software if you don't like what the primary vendor of that software does. And we've seen that happening, and I think that's a very good thing for the technology world.
So the platform strategies of the Googles, Facebooks of this world is now being replicated elsewhere with Microsoft, AWS, and you see open source as a way to protect the customers, to give them a freedom of choice.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of it, if you go all in on, say, AWS, and I'm just picking that as an example because it's the most prominent one, you're really diving deep into some very proprietary APIs if you're not careful. And it's not just the APIs, but it's the service that you run in, where your data sits, where everything you do sits. Now, of course, Amazon is based on a lot of open source stuff and compatible with it in some regards. So if you're careful and you do that, you still have choice when you're building applications for the platform. Now, of course, Google and Microsoft, being the followers in that market, have seen that. And it's no wonder that Microsoft suddenly has become an open source company, because they realize the benefit of providing open source-based services that are fully compatible on Azure, because it is a competitive advantage over what AWS does. And I surely suggest to you all that you make sure to only use open source APIs to be sure that you retain the freedom of choice. Otherwise, you're locked in, and that may come expensive.
And on the models of open source, we've Yeah. Not sure.
I'm not sure. Can you hear me? Now you can hear me. All right. Thanks.
So we've and how do you make money? Because this was always a big question mark around open source. Is it possible to derive license fees, and are you able to develop models that are compatible with the SaaS world that we're seeing emerge all over software?
Yeah, you're just in perpetual fundraising, Curt, I have to be honest. No, of course, we see a lot of open source companies. You mentioned SUSE or Red Hat. They do make a lot of money. They have super high growth. They are profitable businesses. So how do you do that? In the case of Open-XChange, what we've done is we've looked at who derives the most benefit from our software and who's depending on the proper functioning of the software, or if we run the software as a service for our customers, who would be willing to pay money for it? And in the case of email and DNS, it's the ISPs, the hosting companies, people, baking that into part of their commercial offering. I mean, if DNS goes down, so does your internet connection. So if say BT or Deutsche Telekom, uses our Power DNS server, which they do, they better make sure it runs, because if it doesn't, if something breaks, the whole service will go down. So that makes people willing to pay. That's number one. Number two is you have to make sure that you have a scalable business model. It's not so easy to figure. I mean, open source software, it's free in two ways. It's free as in freedom, it gives you freedom of choice, but unfortunately it's also free as in free beer. So why would you pay for a beer that you get for free? Without any nasty data stuff on the other back end, right? It's a really honest model. But the thing is, of course, the skills for the software usually sit with a company. We're bundling a lot of the community skills into Open-XChange. We're 270 people, most of them engineers, and they really know stuff about our software. So where does Deutsche Telekom or BT turn to get help? To us. And what we're saying is, you cannot just buy support from us. That's a support business model for open source. Unfortunately, that doesn't scale very well, because the customers will say, how many people could possibly be working for me? Let's say 3, okay, I pay you 3 people, that's a few $100,000 per year, and that's the deal. What we're saying is, you can't buy support from us and no service level agreements or anything unless you buy a commercial license of the same software that's also open source. And the commercial license then entitles you to support, but the commercial license price is derived from the scale of the usage, the number of subscribers, the number of email accounts, and thus you have an as scalable business model as you have with commercial or proprietary software. Of course, in the software as a service world, it's much easier because customers understand that providing the service also has a scaling cost with the number of users. So if you set up a DNS environment for 100,000 subscribers, it's much smaller than a DNS environment for 50 million subscribers. You need more hardware, more redundancy and stuff, and so customers are much more willing to also pay a scaling price for as a service. The as a service business model, though, has a risk. We've seen that with people like Amazon, who simply take open source software and turn it into a service that they, of course, then can scale in a way that maybe the maker of that software can't, because they don't have the scale that Amazon has with AWS. So you got to somehow also protect that turf. And there are ways of doing that. It's certainly not changing away from an open source license like some of these companies are doing. You have to be a little smarter than that. But we've seen a lot of companies very successfully doing that.
Mm-hmm. And you're probably addressing a big issue for a lot of buyers, which is lock-in, right? The ability to offer open source is also a certain guarantee that you can disengage from a vendor, yeah, which is becoming increasingly a topic for SaaS, people who rely on SaaS today.
Yeah, no, that makes sort of open source business models quite honest in a way. You're not going to squeeze the lifeblood out of your customers, because from a certain, I mean, you've probably seen the news yesterday, CERN, the particle accelerator guys, they've been recategorized by Microsoft to not be a research facility anymore, but something else, whatever, right? I'm not sure what CERN is outside of a research facility, and thus their licensing prices went 10x. Yep. And guess what they did? They saw it coming, and they engaged in a project to move to open source, to an open source platform. I guess from an investor's perspective, of course, it's not that you can build a huge sort of medieval moat around your castle and keep everybody away, because if you're doing too much of that, your customers will simply walk away. That's part of the promise. That's part of the value that you're actually creating. So again, you've got to keep on innovating. You've got to keep on building the best software. But then you're in a virtuous circle of open source software. If you just keep on doing what I described in the very beginning, I don't think you need a moat. You can be much more offensive, much more engaged in your business model instead of being defensive.
Yeah, and on this point, we've seen that open source-based companies have had a tendency or a characteristic that they've been growing in terms of their functionality hugely, right? So you start with a very small footprint of functionality, and then over time, as you grow, the functionality grows much faster than at closed source companies. And you're a case in point. Yeah? When we met first time about 13 years ago.
13 years ago, yeah.
You were doing something very
He didn't
limited.
invest 13 years ago. He just came back every 2 years like Columbo, like one more question. And then 2 years ago, I think you invested, right?
So what's the scope? You started with mail exchange for enterprise?
Yes, indeed. Yes. Actually, I was an investor in SUSE Linux back in 2002. We built a product called SUSE Linux Open-XChange server, which was targeted for on-prem deployments in small and medium enterprises, say 100 users to 1,000 users or so. Then Novell acquired SUSE. They had their own product. It was discontinued. So I started Open-XChange with Frank, my founding partner, to build a product for the whole market, not just depending on SUSE Linux, selling to on-prem medium businesses. And then I met one. I got shown around the data centers of a big hosting company, and I realized that this is the different deployment model. So we built an as-a-service, what you would now call an as-a-service version of our product. But then, of course, putting it out there, more people picking it up, you see more and more use cases. Our software is now running about 6-7 million email servers out there. You run into every possible use case you can imagine. People are doing crazy stuff with our software that we would have never imagined. Now, just imagine doing that for 15 years. Right? You end up having seen every use case you can imagine, building the most robust software, having the best protocol implementation, because the community forces you to do so.
What's the number of end users operated under your software?
Well, with the 6 million email servers, it's about 3 billion users, of which we've commercialized about 220 million that are actually paying us money for it. And then there's this long tail of email servers that we haven't even started monetizing yet. But of course, that's a potential that we're looking into as a company.
So having become a reference partner for ISPs and telcos around the world, what's next? Where do you want to help your customers next?
I mean, we will continue doing that because that's a very nice market. But we do see a lot of interest in driven by data sovereignty. You know, you see a lot of, I think we have to get done here real soon, but I'll answer that one. We see governments, near government organization, education, and so forth. We also see adjacent markets to email. We're going to revolutionize real-time communications, instant messaging, by simply basing it on email, which is open, federated, and permissionless, and there, right? It's an infrastructure that's out there in the world, which will be a whole new use case for us. So there's lots of things that we can innovate in, but also lots of interested parties that want more control over the fate of their IT, let's call it, by utilizing open source software for their work, for their usage.
Very good. Thank you, Rafael.
Thanks.
Thank you.